says locals first, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, who is it going to be for? Now, because you want every African to participate in this part, in this whole, new, the African Continental Free Trade Area, because the idea is to, you want the companies to expand, you want investment to move around the continent, and you want talent to move around the continent, and you want workers to move as well. So maybe the solution is not just eliminating local preferences altogether, because like I mentioned previously, when governments want to preserve jobs for their citizens, it's a right, it's a no-brainer, they should do that. So the solution is not just eliminating the local preferences. Maybe the solution for African countries is developing a continental rule of labor of mobility, right? That protects workers while allowing African economies to benefit from one another, which is what a lot of developing countries do. Yes, you have those preferential treatment for your citizens, but you also have it in a way where, when people come into your country, they're able to benefit from the whole the continental free trade area and the agreements in the policy or in the agreement amongst the African countries. Now let's talk about the free movement. The fact that free movement is not just about jobs. And that's another thing that we have to think about, and that African countries have to think about. And this is where I want to challenge another assumption, which is that when we talk about African mobility, a lot of times we often hear think about foreigners are coming for jobs and things like that. But there's a lot of things when it comes to movement of people. They move education, there's business, there's tourism, of course, family, healthcare, entrepreneurship, and a lot of things as well. And there's access. And I'm going to talk about access later on, because access is very important, especially as we move on to the age of AI and tech and things like that. I think that the thing that is going to hold a lot of Africans back is access. If you watch a lot of young people within the European countries, they have access to Africa. Kai Cenat, these young streamers, the other dude who was at the World Cup, I can't remember his name, I Show Speed. He has access to do streams in Africa. But African young people who are streamers as well don't have that. So it hampers Africans. But that's going to be a topic for later on. So now, the African Union's free movement protocol, right, explicitly connects greater mobility with trade. So if that's the case, you can imagine African students being able to study anywhere on the continent. African entrepreneurs being able to move. African researchers collaborating across borders and things like that. So that's the human side of African integration, because it allows everyone to move about. It's not just about jobs. It's about collaboration. It's about inventions. It's about ideas. It's about so many things. So whenever a lot of times African integrations, people like just think it's about, oh, people are coming to take our jobs, but it's more than that. And that is one of the parts that I think that we don't talk about a lot. Let's forget my mic. All right, so let's talk about the colonial border issue as well, because that's important, because the border problem is one of the things that hampers African integration. And this brings me to something we don't talk about enough, which is many African borders were created during the colonial period. They divided communities, separated families. It disrupted existing networks. People who historically interacted with one another were not able to do so, because this is the oppressors, what the idea is to separate people, right? Divide. So African borders does not now does not kind of support integration. So the interesting question when it comes to this is that should African integration eventually make some of those borders less economically significant, right? So all right. So, like I mentioned, like I was saying previously, because if the integration makes some of those, should the integration make borders less economical, or should African get rid of the old borders altogether? Now, I don't think that should be the case, right? I'm not so I'm not trying to say that borders or Africa should become one country at the same time. But can we maintain national sovereignty? Can African maintain national sovereignty, right? While making it easier for Africans to move between countries. That's that's I think that is like the main thing, and that is what everyone wants. Europe has experimented with this. We know that the Schengen area, it's something that is real, and you'll be surprised to know how much the Schengen states make from Africa through visa rejection. That's going to be my next topic. So we're going to go live on that maybe sometime this week. But back to this, right? So Europe experimented with the Schengen area, and what it is that although Africa has completely different like political and economic and security circumstances than Europe, Africa doesn't necessarily need to copy Europe. However, there is something to learn from the concept of the Schengen state. So the idea is that Africa can do that when it comes to integration by developing their own Schengen kind of thing without copying Europe. Because a lot of times African states tend to copy European regime, their way of things, which it's crazy to me, and it shouldn't be. Africa should be able to develop its own Schengen mechanism, which will help with African integration. Now we're going to look at the visa paradox, right? Like something that African travelers understand is that one, the visa, you want to travel to another country, you fill out forms, you submit documents, bank statements, hotel reservation. There's so much processes that goes into when Africans are trying to travel. And then you wait. Sometimes you wait for weeks, sometimes you wait longer. And the irony is that you're traveling to another country on the same continent, and the visa process is so the red tapes and all that stuff is so much. Now, the African Development Bank has been tracking these barriers for a long time through its Africa Visa Openness Index, which measures how easily it is for Africans to travel within the country. And this is just about convenience, right? It has economic consequences. Every visa barrier potentially affects tourism, business, investment, trade, education, and so many other things. So the visa isn't simply an immigration document, it can become an economic barrier, and we all know this already. And then we have the security issue as well within a lot of African countries, fighting terrorism and things like that. So a lot of African countries are also afraid of that, which is another thing that hampers free movement as well. So free movement doesn't have to mean uncontrolled movement. That's the idea. Because when we talk about free movement, these are the things that are brought up, like terrorism and risk and theft and illegal activities. But it doesn't have to be uncontrolled movement. So you can make legitimate travel easier while strengthening security systems. That's the challenge that Africa has. And there's also like the transportation problem as well. Routes, you can't easily, the flights are incredibly expensive, among African countries, or sometimes you have to travel through Europe and the Middle East to get to another African countries. You're trying to travel to another African country, but your cheapest or easiest, route may take you out of Africa first. And that is an infrastructural problem that Africa has to fix. I know like airlines like Air Peace is helping with such situations. Now let's talk about the single African air transportation market. This is why this is so important, right? The AU describes the single African air transportation market as an initiative aimed at liberalizing intra-African air transport and improving market access and connectivity. Because free movement isn't just about immigration policy. You need, affordable flights, direct routes, competitive airlines, modern transportation and airports and things like that. So you cannot build an integrated continental area like the free trade area if it takes 3 days and almost $1,500 to travel somewhere that is geographically nearby, right? And again, we know about that. There's a lot of economic opportunity in the integration. If the economic integration is gotten right, like there's a lot of exchange. African entrepreneurs in Lagos can easily travel to Ghana, Accra, and so forth, and all that stuff. So it helps and it boosts a lot of things. And through economic integration, there's a lot of things that happen. Like I mentioned, access is key, right? People have access. Young people have access. Young entrepreneurs, young streamers, young content creators, which is the big thing, have access to go to other countries to make content, which helps the economy, which alleviates unemployment and things like that. So free movement could be could create businesses and make markets a much makes Africa a much larger market. Now let's come to xenophobia. I want to talk about that, right? So now we have to talk about the uncomfortable side of the integration or making visa or Africa visa free for Africans. One of the uncomfortable thing is the xenophobia thing that is happening now. As I say xenophobia because that is what is being labeled. Like I mentioned in my past post, I don't know who gives this thing these labels. I don't like to use them, but for the essence of this and for the point I'm trying to pass across, I'm going to say xenophobia. Now, because more African migration, right, can also produce more tension. We've seen what's happening in South Africa. So if Africa doesn't carefully manage free movement, political leaders could turn economic frustration into anti-immigration sentiment. A politician could say your unemployment is high because of foreigners. Exactly what is happening in South Africa, right? So that's the problem. So your healthcare problems are because foreigners are using the system. South Africa is a major case in point, like I mentioned earlier in the video in part one of this. But sometimes they're political convenient and they are scapegoats, right? So and that's the dangerous part of all these things. So that's another area that it is important to look at. Now, we're African unity versus national interest. Now, this brings us to one of the biggest philosophical questions when it comes to African integration is African unity versus national interest. Now, we see Pan African. What does Pan Africanism actually mean in 2026? A lot of people like to say they are Pan African. Now, what does it mean within the context of the year we're in and the times that we're in? Is it simply a cultural unity? Is it a political cooperation? Or is it economic integration? It doesn't mean Africans should eventually have something approaching freedom of movement across the continent. Because if you believe in African economic integration, like I do, right? If you do, basically, then eventually you have to confront a lot of questions. And these questions include, can African unity exist without African mobility? Maybe the answer is yes to that, right? But I don't think the integration will ever reach its fullest potential without the integration or without significantly having mobile of goods and services and also mobility of people at the same time. And then with that, if you have the African passport, if we are looking at mobility of goods, services, and people, what will it actually change? So imagine you don't have to apply for 20 different visas when you're traveling. So it will make things very much easier, study work, investment, and things like that. It could change how Africans think about the continent. Instead of thinking I'm Nigerian, I'm Ghanaian, blah blah blah, it could be like, I'm Nigerian, but Africa is my economic market. And it brings about more of that African unity that we're actually talking about. But we have to be realistic about all this. And that is what my whole thing is, being realistic. Now, I'm not suggesting that Africa should eliminate everybody tomorrow. That would be unrealistic. Different countries have different levels of development, different security environments, different immigration systems, different labor markets, and things like that. So perhaps the answer is progressive integration. Progressive integration. Start with easier tourism, then business travel, then students, then professionals, and things like that. So it's a gradual process to the visa free and economic integration within the continent instead of like a harsh way to do it, right? So that when we have that progressive integration on the continent, it comes in line and is kind of more pertinent to what is actually happening within the in AU African movement framework, which envisions progressive implementation rather than overnight elimination of borders as a whole. So now, what should Africa actually do? So if I'm looking at a policy perspective, I'll suggest several priorities. Number one, expand visa-free travel among African countries, which is already happening, especially within the East Africa. But again, these things are happening within blocks. So SADC, COMESA, ECOWAS. That's where it's happening. It should happen cross block. So SADC to ECOWAS, ECOWAS to COMESA, and things like that. So one is that expand free travel among African countries, improve digital immigration systems. It's happening too, right? I know like you can actually renew like your Nigerian passport online now. Also improve African transportation, develop continental labor mobility, and recognize professional qualifications amongst African, and also address the xenophobia issue. Yes, these are the things Africans should do, and protect local workers intelligently. Unlike what is happening in South Africa, I think there's a better way to do that. The local first movement, there are better ways to do it. Again, this is what Africa should begin to do in order to bring about more integration and then for the African continental free trade area to come into fruition and to come into fruition in a very good way. These are the groundworks that needs to be laid. Now, what is the big question? The big question for Africa is, I'm going to return to where I started when I first, if you look at part one where we started, is that can Africa have one market without free movement of people? Is it possible? Technically, you can integrate without completely eliminating immigration barriers, right? But can you reach the full potential of African economic integration without allowing people to move freely? This is a much harder question to answer for Africa because businesses need people, right? And trade needs people, services need people, investment needs people, tourism needs people, etc., etc., etc. So, so when it comes to Africa's largest resources, isn't it is it's not oil, it's not gold, it's not diamond, it's people. Because Africa is going to have the largest population in the future. A lot of people are talking about the growth of Africa. So the largest resource Africa has is actually people. And laying the ground for people to move freely on the continent, it's important. Africa has one of the largest, youngest population. We know this. The population is going to need jobs, education, entrepreneurship, mobility, and opportunity and access for the young people. And if opportunities don't exist in one country, people will naturally look elsewhere. The question is whether Africa can manage that movement intelligently or continue treating it primarily as a threat, which is not, right? So one Africa is the vision, but can Africans move? So here's where I'm gonna land in all this, right? And and we're going to continue this discussion further on another topic. But I believe Africa should move towards greater freedom of movement for Africans, like the whole visa thing. There should be visa-free movement and all that. But I don't mean uncontrolled borders, right? I don't. People should not ignore insecurity and illegal activities and stuff like that. No, it should not be ignored. And I don't mean pretending national government don't have legitimate responsibility to their citizens. Of course, government should protect their citizens. Their citizens should come first. I mean, we have to build a system of legitimate African travelers, entrepreneurs, students, workers, and so forth moving freely and more easily than it is today. Because if Africa wants to build a genuine continental market, Africans themselves need to move and participate in that market freely, right? The African Continental Free Trade Area gives Africa an economic framework. The African, the AU's movement, free movement protocol gives greater mobility for Africans. And the African passport, it presents a powerful symbol for continental identity and mobility. But now comes the difficult part, right? Implementation. Of course, that's always the thing with all these things is how is Africa going to implement all these things? Because signing agreements is easy. Changing the reality at the border is much, much harder. So I'm going to leave us with these questions. The first question is this, right? Should African countries eventually eliminate visas for African citizens? Two, should Africans have the right to live and work anywhere on the continent? And perhaps the most controversial question of all this is that if another African comes to your country and competes with you for your job, are you still willing to support African free movement? If a Kenyan can compete for a job in Nigeria with a Nigerian graduate, will Nigerians say, hey, let's give the Kenyan the job? That's the question every African has to think about and ask him or herself, because that's where the real debate begins, right? It's easy to say Africans must unite. It's much harder to say I'm willing to share my economic space with another African. But perhaps that's the test. That's the test, right? So if African can solve that contradiction, then the African passport could become much more than a travel document, right? It could become a symbol of new African economic identity. So one continent, many nations, one increasingly connected market as well. And hopefully one day an Africa where Africans can move, work, trade, and build a course without any problem and unnecessary barriers as well. That's the Africa I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area is envisioning, right? Now, another question is that are African governments and citizens ready for it, right? Would you know, would it happen? Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you support visa-free travel for all Africans? The answers for that is yes. Most people will say yes to this, right? But again, would you support the right of Africans to work in other African countries and potentially take your job, right? And would you support if it meant greater competition for so many other things? Let's have the conversation, guys. And as always, kindly like and subscribe to the channel, share the episodes. Let's continue to have the discussion. Once again, man, this is Full Chest. Peace.